Hi everyone, here is my lecture about something I'm interested in researching, which is learning disability, and in particular history or histories of learning disability. So I'm going to talk a bit about the nature of research, about why we research history, and particularly learning disability history, and also a little bit about different ways that you can go about researching learning disability history. So we'll begin just with some consideration of what we're talking about when we talk about research. So when you look at research methods, textbooks and definitions, these are the sorts of words that you see. So research is a purposeful investigation or some sort of inquiry. It's systematic and rigorous. In other words, it is methodical and it is thorough. And it's something that often involves looking at things again and again and looking at them very closely to try and look for what's important, to try and discover what's important. So on this slide, we've got the word research broken down into its components. So we've got the prefix re, and then the root word search. So that prefix re, as you know, it means again, like as in repeat or redo. To search again and again and again. The quote on the slide helps to illustrate that characteristic of research. So it says, research is like finding pieces of the jigsaw. It's looking over and over again. Because sometimes if you look at something once, you don't get to see the full picture. But when you come back and look at it again, you'll see something different. And the more times you go backward and forward to it, the more you see. So that's good. And really that applies to whatever kind of research you're doing, right? That idea that you are looking again and again at something, looking very closely at it, coming back to it repeatedly, time and time again, in order to find the picture, find the patterns, fit it all together. Whatever kind of research you do, that holds true. So as you prepare, for your own research and your own research projects, keep that in mind, right? The various aspects of it, whether it's writing your literature review or analysing your data, all of it, you need to come back to again and again and again in order to really make sense of it. One of the reasons that I chose this particular quote, which is from a paper co-written by one of our former colleagues at Hope, Professor Tina Cook, is that this came from a participatory research project. And participatory research is something I'll talk again about later on in this lecture. It came from a participatory project with men with learning difficulties. So they learning disabilities. So they were co-researchers on Tina Cook's project. And this is actually one of the ways that one of the learning disabled researchers described research. So I thought that's interesting in itself to get that insider perspective on learning disability research. But the definition applies, as I say, more broadly to really any kind of research that you might undertake. Okay, so we've thought now a little bit about what we mean by research, and now I'm going to talk about two particular kinds of research that can be used to research the history of learning disability. Those are documentary research and then participatory research. I suppose it's worth just talking for a moment about why bother, right, to do research like this. And I think that it's important to do historical research really because it helps us to understand the present. So we don't just look into the past for its own sake, but rather we look into the past to see what it can tell us about the present and possibly the future. So you're used to the idea that disability for instance, is socially, culturally, and temporally constructed. And so looking at the history of disability can help to illuminate how that happens, so how that process, how the construction of disability happens, and also help us understand why we think about and talk about disability and learning disability in the way that we do today, and why people have the kinds of attitudes and experiences around learning disability that they do. So part of the reason to do this research is to help us understand the present. Okay, so one way to do research into the history of learning disability is to do research with documents. So that might be books, as on the slide here. So one of the first things I did when I began researching the history of learning disability was go to the library, right? And I got out a ton of books, right? Many more than are in this, this stack in this image here. So the image is a stack of books about learning disability. But I read lots of books, and that is a legitimate way of doing research in its own right. Sometimes, or most obviously, it might be part of the initial literature review of a research project. But sometimes the entire project will rely on pre-existing research, published research, whether that's in books or journal articles or whatnot. And I learned a lot, right? I discovered a lot from just from reading books and reading journal articles. And of course, this is a method which is fairly accessible. Obviously, right now, it's not so easy to get into the library, but in general terms, and as we come back to something more like normal and libraries and whatnot begin to open up again, this way of doing research will become easier again. So, for example, here's one thing that I learned just from reading books. So that people get diagnosed with various types of learning disability. These days we use labels like profound or multiple or specific learning disability or difficulty. Back in the old days, and I'm talking sort of 1800s onwards, there were classifications like idiot, so it was a diagnostic category. Imbecile was a diagnostic category. Feeble-minded was a general term for what we'd now call learning disability. And round about 1910, this guy, Henry H. Goddard, invented a new category, right? He invented a new kind of person, essentially by playing around with the results of the Binet-Simon IQ test, right? The very first, one of the very first recognized standardized IQ tests. And he called this new type of person that he claimed to have discovered the moron. So that's where that word comes from. Right now we use it as an insult, or people use it as an insult, but it began life, as a lot of our insults did, as a medical diagnostic term. So the word moron he got from the old Greek word moros, which means dull. So similar there to the word we still have now, morose, when you're a bit kind of mopey and Eeyore-like. So that's where the category and the word moron comes from. And this new kind of person was thought to be out there, and they were thought to be a menace to society. So this is how they were defined. The moron, also called the moral imbecile in the UK, was a person who, quote, by reason of an innate defect, displays at an early age vicious or criminal propensities which are of an incorrigible or unusable nature and are generally associated with some slight limitation of the intellect. So in other words, these were people who were thought to be of low intelligence and a menace to society because they were criminal, or they were sexually over-reproducing, or they were violent. And so something needed to be done about that. For instance, to put them into asylums, or better yet, to get rid of them altogether. So it was this kind of attitude and this kind of thinking that really provide the basis for much of the eugenics movement, of course, which you know about, and which still filters through in towards attitudes towards disability generally, and learning disability today. For instance, in moves to eradicate Down syndrome through screening programs. So this kind of documentary research can help us trace back and come to understand current attitudes around learning disability. So as James Trent puts it in his book around diagnosis at the time, the morons were said to be out there among us and they were doing bad things. So one of society's solutions to that was to institutionalize people, right? To bang them up, to lock them away. And that, of course, is still happening today, although we don't hear so much about it now. But there are plenty of places, secure hospitals, and special schools, right, and other kinds of places where people who are thought to be of below average intelligence or below acceptable intelligence, and perhaps dangerous and menacing, are locked away from the rest of society. So that was documentary research using books. A different kind of documentary research is to use archive material, if you can get access to it. So this slide, it says it's the Royal Albert Asylum Casebook, Volume 16, Females. So this is actually a huge leather-bound ledger of the admissions book for what was called an idiot asylum up near Lancaster. And it's a huge book. It's like something you'd see, like in Harry Potter or something. This huge leather-bound book. You have to put it on a special rest to open it. Be very, very careful how you handle it. And in this admissions book, there is documentary evidence of people being admitted to the Royal Albert Asylum. So there are photographs of people upon admission, like this one of this lady here. There's other kinds of evidence, like these hand-drawn family trees. So each of these circles represents one of this lady's relatives, and the various sort of symbols and shadings within the circles represent characteristics of that person. For instance, if they were known to have some sort of disability, or to be alcoholic, or to be thought to be inbred, right, or something like that. So then it becomes obvious how this sort of institutionalization is linked to programs to eradicate learning disabled people through sort of sterilization and eugenics. And then here in the bottom right-hand corner, all these pluses and minuses are actually results of a Binet-Simon intelligence test. It actually says it there, Binet-Simon test up at the top. So it says things like, can tell the time to a 5-minute interval, but cannot place hands at 13 minutes to 2 on the clock. Gives correct change in coins, but cannot do the same sum on paper, right, and so on. So those are the kinds of tests of intelligence that people underwent. And in just on the right-hand side here, you can see there's an actual diagnosis, right, of imbecile, right? So this lady has been diagnosed as an imbecile as a result of this test here. So again, this can help us to understand our current societal fascination still with learning disability, with intelligence, with IQ tests, with normalizing and standardizing things, with genetics and heredity, and all these things that are still concerns of of people relating to disability. This is an actual page of notes now on the screen from the ledger, and you can see there is line after line after line of descriptions of this lady's life in the asylum. She actually died in the asylum, having spent about 30 years in there. Once she got in, she never got out. And the doctors wrote these extremely detailed case histories of everything that happened to her. So again, there are links to ideas around surveillance, control, observation, and confinement and segregation of people with learning disabilities, which again we continue to see today. Okay, so those are all kinds of research which you can do by yourself, right? Just working with documents and other kinds of text, books, journal articles, and these kinds of archive materials, if you can get hold of them. And there are some, for instance, in our own special collection in the library at home. Another way of doing research into the history of learning disability is called participatory research. And that is where people with learning disabilities actually do the research, probably alongside an academic researcher or researchers. So the difference really with participatory research is that it is about collaboration, about learning disabled and non-disabled people working together to set the agenda and undertake all the various aspects of the research. This is perhaps the more, from a disability studies point of view, perhaps it's a desirable way to do research because it puts disabled people's opinions and knowledge and skills sort of front and center rather than the academics. At the same time, it's very challenging to do because it's complex and time consuming, and there are a lot of different factors that have to be taken into account. But it's important, I think, for you to be aware of that approach to research, even if it's probably not possible for you to do it yourselves. But one thing that we do know about these participatory research is that learning disabled people can do it, and they can do it in ways that fulfill these criteria of being purposeful, systematic, and rigorous. So in this project, we all together, researchers who were learning disabled and not, were purposefully and systematically and rigorously analysing archive material in order to understand both how learning disability was conceptualised back in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and how that relates to people's experience of learning disability today. There is a separate lecture that I've done solely on participatory research for those of you on the single honours, so you guys can get more detail on that there. And you can also find out more from these sources, right? So we had a project website, or we have a project website here, the Brain Charity. .org.uk/Antonia. She was the lady at the centre of our case study. And this is the archive that we used, the digital archive, the UK Medical Heritage Library. It's freely accessible on the web. And there's a link, I'll update this on the PowerPoint that you get on Moodle, but a link to the Wellcome Library, which is another huge archive of kind of medical heritage material, including stuff around learning disability. Plus stuff that I've written about this and published about this if you want to get more scholarly. Okay, thanks everyone. That's the end of the lecture. Hope you found that interesting. See you around.